When you look at the Bible literature, the Bible has more variety, more different types of literature examples than perhaps any other book. For instance, there's apocalyptic literature, prophetic literature, things like the book of Revelation, other areas of the Bible where they talk about the future and predictions of the future. We're all kind of familiar with that. There is what would be known as didactic literature, things like the epistle to the Ephesians or to the Colossians, where Paul is teaching point by point. Didactic is a teaching type of literature, and Paul is teaching point by point. He will say, these are the three things, or these are, and we do didactic type sermons. If you look at a lot of the history of the Old Testament, that's narrative. It's storytelling. You know, stories of Moses, stories of Abraham and Sarah and others. And the book of Acts is the same way. Most of it is Luke telling the story of the Apostle Paul and his journeys and his travels, so it's historical narrative. It's historically accurate as far as we have been able to determine, and of course it should be because it's inspired by God. But it's a little bit different. It's kind of like telling your child a bedtime story. It's the kind of literature that you would sort of read through, and so some people are finding it difficult. We have 4 chapters to go in the book of Acts, and some people are finding it difficult because it's not this sort of ongoing, dynamic, didactic literature where we're learning something, 4 points for your Christian life. It's more, this is the history, but it's one of the most crucial books. That's why we've called it Adventures in Acts. And it deals with the growth and the birth of the church of Jesus Christ. But it's like a story, and today I'm going to tell it to you like a story, and we're going to cover a great deal of ground. We're going to cover from chapter 22 to chapter 24, much more like you would do in a Sunday school class than in a sermon. But we want to do that, so we finish through the book of Acts, and we're going to move on to the book of Revelation, and then we'll be dealing with apocalyptic or prophetic literature. We've highlighted the travels of the Apostle Paul and his missionary journeys. We've done that week after week, brought us up to the end of chapter 21 after his 3rd missionary journey, and we're now in a series of accusations and trials which cover from chapter 21 to 26, and Paul ends up going to Rome and is imprisoned there and will eventually die there. With that in mind, we pick it up in Acts chapter 22, verse 22, and Paul is still in Jerusalem and he is under arrest. It said the crowd listened to Paul until he said this. Said what? Basically what he said is that the Jews and the Gentiles in Christ are on equal footing. The Jewish people thought that was anathema. They thought that was blasphemy. How could a Gentile be on the same par with a Jewish person? But the Jewish Christians were beginning to learn that the Gentile Christians, that God, and you and I are mostly Gentile in our background, that God had opened the doors so that everyone could come to Christ. You didn't have to come through Judaism, you just had to come through Christ. But they couldn't handle this. And there was a lot of prejudice, just like we have prejudice and racism in our country today. There was different groups and different sects, and they hated each other, to be perfectly honest with you. You had the Jews, and then you had the Gentiles, and stuck in the middle were the Samaritans, who were half Jewish and half Gentile, and basically they were hated by both groups. So if you were a Samaritan, you couldn't win at all. If you were a Gentile, you couldn't win, and you could only go to the court of the Gentiles for the men in the temple. So the crowd listened to Paul until he said this, that they're even and they're equal. Then they raised their voices and shouted, "Rid the earth of him, he's not fit to live." Can you imagine saying that about another human being? It's amazing. He's not fit to live because he says something we disagree with. You haven't heard that on a political scene, have you? Of course. The rhetoric, the garbage that goes back and forth is absolutely terrible. Pick it up in verse 23. As they were shouting and throwing off their cloaks and flinging dust into the air, which was a sign of pronouncing a curse on this individual, the commander ordered that Paul be taken into the barracks. He directed that he be flogged and interrogated in order to find out why the people were shouting at him like this. I love this. What's the first thing you do? You don't ask questions, you flog them. All right? That's that's the Roman way. Let's go beat the guy up, and then we'll talk a little bit about why did this happen? What's going on? He directed that he be flogged and interrogated in order to find out why the people were shouting at him like this. As they stretched him out to flog him, Paul said to the centurion, remember, a centurion is a commander over 100 people. A commander is over 1,000 people in the Roman army. He said, "Is it legal for you to flog a Roman citizen who hasn't even been found guilty?" Oops. Uh-oh. They're in trouble. Verse 26, when the centurion heard this, he went to the commander and reported it. "What are you going to do?" he asked. "This man is a Roman citizen." The commander went to Paul and asked, "Tell me, are you a Roman citizen?" "Yes," I answered. "I am," he answered. Then the commander said, "I had to pay a lot of money for my citizenship." Apparently this commander bought his citizenship, which was possible to do in Rome if you had enough money. "But I was born a citizen," Paul replied. Those who were about to interrogate him withdrew immediately. The commander himself was alarmed when he realized that he had put Paul, a Roman citizen, in chains. You couldn't do that. You couldn't flog him. You couldn't even, arrest him, but he ended up staying arrested for now. And then the next thing that happens is Paul meets before the Sanhedrin. The commander wanted to find out exactly why Paul was being accused by the Jews. So the next day he released him and ordered the chief priests and all the members of the Sanhedrin to assemble. Then he brought Paul in and had him stand before him. We're going to learn a little bit more about the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin was a group of 70 individuals made up of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. We'll explain that in a minute. Acts 23, verse 1, the new chapter. Paul looked straight at the Sanhedrin and said, "My brothers, I have fulfilled my duty to God in all good conscience to this day." Paul could address the Sanhedrin because he was a Pharisee. At this, the high priest, Ananias, ordered those standing near Paul to strike him on the mouth. Now, you need to understand something. This is not normal fare, but apparently Ananias, as a high priest, had a hot temper. He was known for his violence, for dealing with things in a violent kind of way. So basically he said, let's smack Paul around a little bit. This is not, our culture the way we want it to be. Then Paul said to him, "God will strike you, you whitewashed wall." Now, you're standing there, your accuser is about to smack you, and you insult him. He called him a whitewashed wall. You know what that means? You're a phony. You're a fake. Why do you whitewash a wall? Because it's moldy and ugly and falling apart, and you want to put something on it to make it look better. And that's what he called the high priest. "You sit here to judge me according to the law, yet you yourself violate the law by commanding that I be struck," because he's another Pharisee, he's another Roman citizen, and there's no reason for him to be struck. Those who were standing near Paul said, "How dare you insult God's high priest?" There's always someone who comes along and says, "Don't you respect this high priest?" Even if the high priest is corrupt. Now, you're going to find out later that Paul actually respected the office of the high priest. And that's an important principle, that God puts people in power, even corrupt people in power. And it doesn't mean that we have to agree with everything they do, but it does mean that we have to honor that office because God gives us protection through that office, through that person. Paul replied, "Brothers, I did not realize that he was the high priest. For it is written, do not speak evil about the ruler of your people. So Paul respected this, but in the confusion, it doesn't mean that he didn't, well, he might not have known the high priest. And the reason he might not have known the high priest is, remember, he's been traveling for a number of years. And so he might not have known. He hadn't been back to Jerusalem for quite a while. And also, there was such a crowd there, he might not have even been knowing who was giving the orders, even though this general idea of a person, and the high priest probably wasn't in his robes at the time because he wasn't doing priestly duties. So it might have been a little bit of confusion, but Paul did respect that office. Then Paul, knowing that some of them were Sadducees and the others Pharisees. This is where Paul, as a lawyer, comes in. You got to love this. Paul, knowing that some of them were Sadducees and the others were Pharisees, called out in the Sanhedrin, my brothers, I am a Pharisee, descended from Pharisees. I stand on trial because of the hope of the resurrection of the dead. Now, you might not know it, but that's a hot spot. That's a red flag right there. And do you know why? Because the Sadducees, and we do a little thing in a seminar I used to teach, we say they are Sadducee, and you kind of like make a frown. Do you know why they're sad? He goes on to explain it. He says, I'm a Sadducee, a Pharisee, descended from the Pharisees. I stand here for the hope of the resurrection of the dead. That was a foundational belief of the Pharisees that the Sadducees denied. They didn't believe that you came back to life afterwards. They didn't believe there was any afterlife. They were more like a political group that ran Jerusalem and ran some of the temple works there in Jerusalem. When he said this, a dispute broke out between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Now they're in an argument. And the assembly was divided. And Luke puts, he didn't have parentheses then in the Greek, but we know it's kind of in parentheses. The Sadducees, he makes his comment. The Sadducees say there is no resurrection and that there are neither angels nor spirits. There's nothing supernatural. But the Pharisees believed all of these things. So Paul, as a smart lawyer, pitted them against each other and said, okay, you guys, you don't know what you're talking about, so let you fight between you and then still try to come up with charges against me. And there were no good charges against Paul, to be honest with you. But the Sadducees didn't believe in the afterlife, didn't believe in the resurrection. It was all on a very natural plane, and yet they were the ones who were in charge of the temple. The Pharisees were like the typical Bible teachers. They believed a lot of the literalness of the Bible. They believed in the supernatural, in spirits, and in angels. So they continue. There was a great uproar, and some of the teachers of the law who were Pharisees stood up and argued vigorously. We find nothing wrong with this man. What's the problem? We're all fighting, but what's the problem? They said, what if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him? The dispute became so violent that the commander was afraid Paul would be torn to pieces by them. He ordered the troops to go down and take him away from them by force and bring him into the barracks. The following night, the Lord stood near Paul and said, and if you were Paul, you might be saying, what's happening here? You know, I wanted to come have an open audience with the Jews in Jerusalem, and Lord, I don't know what's going on. And so Paul, the Lord appeared to him, take courage. As you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome. So Paul knows that he's going to go to Rome as a Roman citizen and stand trial before Caesar. But in the intervening time, here he is still in Jerusalem. The next morning, some Jews formed a conspiracy and bound themselves with an oath not to eat or drink until they had killed Paul. What an oath, okay? We're not going to eat or drink until that guy's dead. That's our plan. More than 40 men were involved in this plot. They went to the chief priest and the elders and said, we have taken a solemn oath not to eat anything until we have killed Paul. And they said, oh no, you don't want to do that. No, they said, we're good with that. No problem. Now then, you and the Sanhedrin petition the commander to bring him before you on the pretext of wanting more accurate information about this case. So you collude with us. We are ready to kill him before he gets here. You want to see what God does. But when the son of Paul's sister, apparently Paul had a sister, she was probably living in Jerusalem, or at least was there in Jerusalem. And so Paul's nephew was probably in his 20s or 30s, as much as they can calculate. Paul's nephew heard about this plot. He went to the barracks and told Paul. Then Paul called one of the centurions and said, "Take this young man to the commander. He has something to tell him." So he took him to the commander. The centurion said, "Paul, the prisoner, sent for me and asked me to bring this young man to you because he has something to tell you." The commander took the young man by the hand, drew him aside, and asked, "What is it you want to tell me?" Do you know what's really interesting? Luke is a Greek physician. Luke's language is so specific and so precise. If you were writing this story, would you say, the commander took the young man by the hand? Now, you would think if it was a little boy who was 8 years old, that might happen. But here's a man in his 20s or 30s, perhaps, and Luke is that very, as a physician, is that specific about this information. Now, it's a really minor point, but it just fascinates me when I read this kind of literature. What is it you want to tell me? He said, "Some of the Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul before the Sanhedrin tomorrow on the pretext of wanting more accurate information about him. Don't give in to them, because more than 40 of them are waiting in ambush for him. They have taken an oath not to eat or drink until they have killed him. They are ready now, waiting for your consent to their request." The commander dismissed the young man with this warning: "Don't tell anyone that I have reported that you've reported this to me." So with that, the commander transfers Paul to Caesarea up by the sea north of Jerusalem. Then he called 2 of his centurions and ordered them, "Get ready a detachment." Now look at the numbers here. Of 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen to go to Caesarea at 9 tonight. Again, look, very specific. But could you imagine? You need that many guards for someone like the Apostle Paul. "Provide horses for Paul so that they may be taken safely to Governor Felix." This is not Felix the cat. I want you to understand. That's one of those strange Roman names that comes up. He wrote a letter as follows. The commander's name was Claudius Lysias, and he wrote this: "To His Excellency Governor Felix, greetings." That's the way they would open these letters. And he writes this letter: "This man was seized by the Jews, and they were about to kill him, but I came with my troops and rescued him, for I had learned that he is a Roman citizen. I wanted to know why they were accusing him, so I brought him to their Sanhedrin. I found that the accusation had to do with questions about their law, but there was no charge against him that deserved death or imprisonment. But I'm going to imprison him anyway. I'm going to send him to jail anyway. When I was informed of a plot to be carried out against this man, I sent him to you at once. I also ordered his accusers to present to you their case against him." So the soldiers carried out the orders, took Paul with them during the night, and brought him as far as Antipatris. The next day, I'll show you where that is on the map in a moment. The next day, they left the cavalry go on with him while they returned to the barracks. When the cavalry arrived at Caesarea, they delivered the letter to the governor and handed Paul over to him. The governor read the letter and asked what province he was from. Learning that he was from Cilicia, he said, "I will hear your case when your accusers get here." Then he ordered that Paul be kept under guard in Herod's palace up along the coast of Caesarea. Let me just show you what's happening here. This is the start of his trip to Rome. We're here in Jerusalem. Antipatris is here partway between Jerusalem and Caesarea, and they're going to get as far as Caesarea. Another way to look at it, this is Caesarea. That's the amphitheater there and the coast where Herod's palace was. here on the coast. There's not much left of it yet, but it's still a beautiful place. And the amphitheater. Those of you who've been to Israel, you've been there, right? So it's one of the first places that they take you up here, walking around in the theater. And then there's also, if you go up or down the coast, I don't remember which, there's a Crusaders fort that's there. You've been to, I don't know if they took you to that or not, but it's a pretty fascinating area. Another way to look at it is from Jerusalem here up to Caesarea. And then you can see this is going to be what happens for him to get to Rome. There's a number of shipwrecks and other things, so we'll be looking at that again. But we're not going to spend a lot of time on the shipwrecks because you guys, your eyes are glossing over just as it is. Acts 24, verse 1. 5 days later, the high priest Ananias went down to Caesarea with some of the elders. Now, why do they say down to Caesarea again? Caesarea is north, but it's coming down the hill, 2,500 feet, Jerusalem, because Jerusalem's a city set on the hill. So they talked in terms of geography. They went down the hill to Caesarea, even though they were going north, with some of the elders and a lawyer named Tertullus. And they brought their charges against Paul before Felix. We have enjoyed a long period of peace under you, and your foresight has brought about reforms in this nation. What are they doing? They're buttering up Felix. They're like, yeah, you're a good guy. We like you. You better side with us. Everywhere and in every way, most excellent Felix, we acknowledge this with profound gratitude. They're just gushing all over him. But in order to not weary you further, because we know you're a busy man, I would request that you be kind enough to hear us briefly. We have found this man to be a troublemaker, talking about Paul, stirring up riots among the Jews all over the world. Again, fake news. He is a ringleader of the Nazarene sect and even tried to desecrate the temple. Another lie. How would he desecrate the temple? They said they took Gentile Christians into the temple. He never did that. So we seized him. By examining him yourself, you will be able to learn the truth about all these charges we are bringing against him. The other Jews joined in the accusation, asserting that these things were true. So you had a whole party of people saying, yeah, it's the truth, it's the truth. But it was a lie. Isaiah, to paraphrase Isaiah says, if you call the truth a lie long enough, people believe it's a lie. If you call the lie truth long enough advertising, people believe it's the truth. Nothing has changed in our world because people are the same, and it's a sad situation. Verse 10, when the governor motioned for him to speak, Paul replied, I know that for a number of years you have been a judge over this nation, so I gladly make my defense. You can easily verify that no more than 12 days ago I went up to Jerusalem to worship. My accusers did not find me arguing with anyone at the temple or stirring up a crowd in the synagogues or anywhere else in the city. I wasn't doing this. And they cannot prove to you the charges they are now making against me. However, I admit that I worship the God of our ancestors as a follower of the way, another word for Christianity, which they call a sect, and there's your problem. They didn't recognize it as an official religion. It was something that would displace Judaism, and they couldn't stand it. And it would bring in Gentiles, and that would corrupt their religious system. And so the Jews could not stand that. I believe everything that is in accordance with the law and that is written in the prophets. So he's confirming the Old Testament. He's confirming every prophecy of Jesus Christ the Messiah in the Old Testament. And I have the same hope in God as these men themselves have, that there will be a resurrection of both the righteous and the wicked. That there's an afterlife. That's all he's saying. He's saying, I'm a Pharisee. I'm consistent with my beliefs that there's an afterlife. So I strive always to keep my conscience clear before God and man. After an absence of several days, I came to Jerusalem to bring my people gifts for the poor and to present offerings. I was ceremonially clean when they found me in the temple. Remember that story from last week? in the courts doing this. There was no crowd with me, nor was I involved in any disturbance, but there are some Jews from the province of Asia who ought to be here before you and bring charges if they have anything against me. Or these who are here should state what crime they found in me when I stood before the Sanhedrin, because there was no crime. Unless it was this one thing I shouted as I stood in their presence. It is concerning the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial today. So the whole question is, do people raise from the dead? Is there an afterlife? Paul says yes. The Sanhedrin, the Sadducees say no, and the Pharisees say yes. And so it's a big confusing thing. And the Romans, honestly, the political leaders, they don't care. They're only living for this life. They don't have any spiritual dimension unless they've met Christ, which many of them did, fortunately. Then Felix, this is finishing it up, who was well acquainted with the way. He understood Christianity. It was in his empire. Adjourned the proceedings. When Lysias the commander comes, he said, I will decide your case. He ordered the centurion to keep Paul under guard, but to give him some freedom and permit his friends to take care of his needs. So he was under house arrest there. Several days later, Felix came with his wife Drusilla, who was Jewish. He sent for Paul and listened to Paul as he spoke about faith in Christ Jesus. As Paul talked about righteousness, self-control, and judgment to come, the afterlife, Felix was afraid and said, that's enough for now. I don't want to hear about spiritual things anymore. You may leave. I love this. Politics. When I find it convenient, I will send for you. In the meantime, Paul, you can rot in jail. Basically what he said. When I find it convenient, I will send for you. At the same time, he was hoping that Paul would offer him a bribe, which often happened. So he sent for him frequently and talked with him. Now get this, verse 27, we'll finish with this. When 2 years had passed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus, but because Felix wanted to grant a favor to the Jews, he left Paul in prison for 2 years. Wow, is that Roman justice or what? What would your lawyers be doing if you were left in prison for 2 years on unfounded charges? It's pretty amazing. And yet God was with Paul. It was not an easy situation. So the next time you and I go through difficult times, look at Paul. Look at what this man put up with. And you and I, as hard as it might get, it'll get better. It'll get better. And God's grace will take us through it. I said last week, Paul's whole heart was being a fisher of men and women. He wanted to tell people. So for those 2 years that he was chained to a Roman guard, and the guard changed often, like every 6 or 8 hours, guess what he did? Talk to them about Jesus. Talk to them about his hope of the resurrection of the dead. Talk to them about afterlife. Talk to them about eternal life and forgiveness of sins. That's what we're all about. That's the only thing we're all about.